All right. Welcome, folks. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar. We know that our election needs are changing in the face of a dynamic COVID-19 pandemic. We know that this is kind of an unprecedented situation for communities around the country, but communities have also been fighting for representation for decades. It's not sort of a new battle for communities to be talking about how best to get representation in the electorate. Today, we're talking with community organizers and advocates from 3 different states. We have Cynthia Dai from California, we have Maria Perez from New Mexico, and Mike Griffin from Minnesota. We'll hear from each of them and see how our electoral system leads to problems of reflective and diverse representation and how we can improve the system to get better representation. We'll look at how ranked choice voting offers a systematic way forward. Just in terms of a quick sort of tech Q&A, we'll take audience questions at the end after we get through a few structured questions that we have, but we do want to hear from you. At any point in the webinar, feel free to use the Q&A function to get in touch with us, and we'll queue up your questions. And without further ado, we can get started. I'd like to start by introducing each of our panelists. They have done so much in such little time. So first we have Cynthia Dai. Cynthia currently serves on the inaugural California Citizens Redistricting Commission, which eliminated partisan gerrymandering in the nation's most diverse and populous state. Since 2018, she and other commissioners have made over 30 trips to other states to support redistricting reform with the generous support of Harvard's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. As an experienced entrepreneur, Ms. Dai has advised growth organizations and social ventures for 20 plus years, and she often serves as the interim executive of both early stage and public ventures. Ms. Dai has an MBA from the Stanford Graduate School of Business and a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science with honors from UC Berkeley, where she voted in her first election using preferential proportional voting. So welcome, Cynthia.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We also have Mike Griffin. He's a political strategist, trainer, and community organizer. He's actually worked as an electoral organizer for community change. He's worked with organizers in 5 different states on strategies to build power, win issue campaigns. He began his career as an organizer working with the Barack Obama 2008 presidential campaign in North Carolina, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. Mike then went on to serve as the Minnesota State Field Director for Organizing for America and the Youth Director for Minnesotans United for All Families. As the Field Director of FairVote Minnesota, Mike played a critical role in bringing ranked choice voting, woohoo, to Minneapolis and St. Paul. Mike holds a degree in political science from the University of Minnesota. Welcome, Mike. And finally, we have Maria Perez. Born and raised in Ecuador, Maria immigrated to the United States in the 1990s to pursue her education. She has crafted a career guided by her passion to address social disparities. She's a seasoned nonprofit leader, organizer, facilitator, advocate, educator, and coalition builder. And she's a firm believer in the power of people coming together to address complex social problems. She actually spent over 10 years as a healthcare practitioner before turning to policy, equity, and advocacy work, which she has been doing for the past 8 years. She served as the campaign lead and the interim hub manager for the California Endowments Project building Healthy Communities in East Oakland. She's been the director of FairVote New Mexico, and more recently, campaign manager for Common Cause New Mexico. Needless to say, she's a national expert on the issue of ranked choice voting, and she believes that democracy is the ultimate health equity indicator. She founded the firm Democracy in Action, which works at the intersection of equity and democracy in 2019. Welcome to all of the panelists. Hi, Maria.
Hi.
So we'll start first with you, Cynthia. Cynthia, we are currently in the middle of a pandemic. That's obvious to all of us, but we're also in a crucial census year. And the census is pretty critical for communities of color and a lot of folks looking for representation as we look at population shifts over time. Can you tell us a little bit about why the census is important in terms of redrawing legislative boundaries for states across the country?
Sure. So as everyone hopefully knows, the census is the source of truth to allocate trillions of dollars of taxpayer funds to support everything from schools and healthcare to infrastructure. And hopefully everyone here on this call has already filled in their census information and returned that. But it is also what helps us reapportion the number of 435 congressional seats in Congress. And this is important because they're based on population growth or declines. The number of representatives may change. Now, I think in Washington, you guys are probably going to remain the same. But for us in California, there's a lot of speculation that California will lose a seat for the first time in history. We've usually gained, and in the last redistricting, the census cycle, we actually stayed flat, which was the first time. And now, there's concern that we might actually lose a seat. And what comes right after reapportionment is redistricting, which is what the California Citizens Redistricting Commission was involved in, and that is drawing the electoral districts for Congress based on that reapportionment. So we currently have 53 representatives, and if it goes down to 52, that will completely scramble all of those lines.
And you did serve on the California Citizens Redistricting Commission. So can you explain how that came to be, what got you there, and sort of what that process looked like?
Sure. I'm actually still on the Redistricting Commission. Our terms are for 10 years and don't end until the next commission is selected, which they're going through the selection process right now, and hopefully I will be relieved of duty by July. So what happened in California is in 2001, the California legislature conspired to do a bipartisan gerrymander or an incumbency protection act. So they basically drew safe districts for everyone in office. And the result of that was that since everybody had a safe district, there was basically no accountability to the voters. And the folks in office were kind of driven to the extremes of their parties. There was absolute gridlock in Sacramento. Legislation wasn't being passed. The budgets weren't being passed. Our bond rating tanked. You might remember our then governor, Schwarzenegger, was so desperate he called our legislators girly men. It was not a good situation. California was called the ungovernable state by the Economist. And basically voters were fed up. And in 2008, we passed by initiative, which we have here, the Voters First Act, which fired the legislature from drawing electoral districts and put it in the hands of essentially a nonpartisan Citizens Redistricting Commission consisting of 4 ordinary citizens, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 independents. And we draw the lines, and we do so in a very transparent way with community input to draw districts that are fair and equitable for everyone in California.
That's definitely a model for the country. I know a lot of what you said resonates with me because people think Washington is ahead of the curve and think we may have an independent redistricting commission, but really similar to California, we actually have a bipartisan redistricting commission. So a lot of districts that are not very competitive and many similar problems. So I think that's a model going forward. I do also want to ask you, this is kind of a 2-part question, but how has the landscape changed before and after the commission in terms of representation on the elected body? And also, how do different jurisdictions in California, whether it be cities, school boards, tackle this problem of underrepresentation?
Sure. So there was a big change. First of all, California had been gerrymandered for, we had to undo all of the gerrymander, basically. Meanwhile, demographic shifts in California had not been reflected in appropriate districts. And California, as you know, had a very fast growing, both Asian and particularly Asian and Latino populations, and actually a declining African-American population. And none of that was properly reflected in the district lines. So when we had to figure out how to draw, 177 districts. So we not only drew congressional lines, but also our state assembly and state senate lines. We had to take all of this into account. And a central concept in California's constitutional criteria is this concept of communities of interest. And so we heard from communities of interest all throughout California about what they wanted to see in their district to ensure fair representation. And so we drew kind of part of our requirement was, of course, adhering to the Voting Rights Act. And so we drew an impressive number of additional Latino majority minority districts. We drew the nation's first Asian American majority minority district, which was an assembly district. And what do you think the result was? As a result, our legislature and our congressional delegation became much more diverse. An unprecedented number of women and minority candidates actually succeeded and got elected. Kind of a dirty little secret is that, well, it wasn't such a secret. The California Democratic Party opposed redistricting reform in California because, of course, they were the party in power, and whoever the party in power is opposes reform. But because of the incumbent protection program, the gerrymander previously, the incumbents, as you might expect, were largely older, white, male incumbents. And I can speak as one of the 5 Democrats on the commission that it has completely revitalized the Democratic Party, because it basically cleared the deck for a whole new generation of a more diverse, younger group of elected officials now, who better represent the true diversity of California. So that's kind of an answer to your first question of what the commission did. And the commission, remember, is just responsible for drawing the district lines. And that is the kind of the thing you have to worry the most about when you have a single winner situation, is you have to draw appropriate district to accommodate that. And that's why gerrymandering is such a political act. In San Francisco, I live in a municipality that has ranked choice voting. We call it instant runoff. And it is largely, I think, the reason that Mayor London Breed won election as the first female African-American mayor of a major city in the United States, in San Francisco. And because of the ranked choice voting, she won after 11 rounds of transferring votes and eliminating other candidates who had not received as many votes, and came out victorious. So
I'm sure she had to build a lot of coalitions to make that happen. I know we follow that election closely. We bring it up in our presentations as well, because it really changes the nature of campaigning, doesn't it? Ranked choice voting. You really have to build coalitions. You get rid of some of that negative campaigning that's so pernicious to traditional sort of electoral politics. So I find that
it's interesting because her competition was equally diverse. So we had a gay man running, as well as a Korean American woman. Right. And they actually realized that they weren't going to get as many votes, and they actually allied together and said, if I don't win, vote for her, or if she doesn't win, vote for me. And so it was interesting. There was a pretty strong coalition between the third and the second and the third place ranked candidates, but it was in the end not enough to overcome London Breed's second choice votes.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. Let's move now to Minnesota. Mike, you've been steeped in the world of organizing ever since the Obama campaign, and have worked on ranked choice voting in St. Paul and Minneapolis. Can you talk to us about why ranked choice voting is an improvement over our current choose one plurality winner system? Also love your background. Awesome.
So I know a lot of folks don't know where Minneapolis is, so I was going to switch it very briefly to copy Cynthia over there. This is beautiful Minneapolis. We're Minnesota, land of like 10,000, 15,000, some type of those thousand lakes. Prince is also from Minnesota. We also was we followed the West Coast lead and picked up ranked choice voting in Minneapolis in 2009. I started with Obama in 2008. By the time I came back to Minneapolis, we had this new system of voting that I was very excited about. And I teamed up with Gene Massey to really help out with the education campaign and the St. Paul transition there. But now, before 2009 in Minneapolis, we had a city council that looked the opposite of me. They were older, they were rich, and they were white. And that was because we had a lot of old, rich, white people participating in our two-step process. We eliminated the primary and we rolled it into one big election with ranked choice voting, and that's been wildly successful. So let me talk to you about some points of the reason why it's been so wildly successful. One is that in Minneapolis, we quickly realized that it mitigated money. So traditionally before 2009, whoever spent the most, if you raised enough money to get on TV, if you raised enough money to send out a mail piece to every person, you traditionally won because it was a first past the post. If you got the most votes, you won. So if you were at 5, 6, 7 people running, you can win with, 25% of the vote. That's how the current president won his primary. How our Democratic nominee won this primary is that without ranked choice voting, you're able to win without getting an absolute true majority. So we mitigated money by, if you were able to build a coalition by picking up second and third place votes, you were able to win an election, and that was more important than actually spending a whole lot of money. So actually organizing and understanding ranked choice voting was actually more powerful than money. As I mentioned before, the reason why it was successful, I'm going to talk about it again because how we set it up is going to be interesting. We eliminated the primary. So we usually had 2 elections in Minnesota, one election in August, and then the election in the general election. Now that August election narrowed the primary to 2 people. Usually those 2 people were old, rich, white people. Because in that primary August election, the only people that voted was old, rich, white people.
Right.
And so the general election, where people like me showed up, the only 2 choices were old, rich, white people. So eliminating the primary actually had more choice and more power for that one big election that everybody participated in. I've started with Obama. I have been an advocate trying to get Black folks to be active in voting in elections. So one thing that ranked choice voting does, it eliminates the spoiler effect, which actually gives more voters power. So at the Griffin family, over Thanksgiving, we usually argue about who is better, Beyonce or Rihanna. And this year, we argue, who are we voting for, Cory Booker or Kamala Harris?
Wow.
Black families around the country were negotiating amongst ourselves about who we were going to vote for, right? Instead of having the ability to rank our vote. So eliminating the spoiler effect for Black folks, for people of color, for people who traditionally have to argue and wrestle about who they're going to vote for, or be able to say, like, how about you run this year and I run next year, and trying to negotiate with candidates, that is over with ranked choice voting. So it actually gives more power to the candidate when they get into office, as the last point I want to make on this section. So as I started with Barack Obama. Now, this is weird because usually I can do a call and response and I can see people's face and reactions and, I can hear people. So we're going to try to have this work. Okay, so you can be my audience.
Yeah.
Okay. Traditionally, when I started for Barack Obama, I was organizing in Winston-Salem. And it was a Barack Obama versus John Edwards versus Hillary Clinton in the winter of 2007. If I knocked on the door, right, and that voter told me they were voting for Hillary Clinton, what did I do as a young organizer? That was the end of the conversation. I didn't register them to vote. I didn't ask for them what issues they cared about. I did not try to pursue that voter at all. That was the end of the conversation. Now, with ranked choice voting, as an organizer, you need to train your staff, you need to train the candidate, you need to train people who are out there, that you need to still talk to that person because you need their second choice vote. So therefore, I'm asking you about an issue that you care about. Why do you like your first choice? I'm doing some research to figure out what issues I'm connected to your first choice. I'm not going to talk trash about the person that you think is number one. It mitigates negativity in campaigns as well. So because of that, in Minneapolis, we have bold initiatives that we're pushing. Because people are elected with a true majority, true asking what actually people care about, we actually are passing rent control. We're the first Midwest city to pass a $15 an hour minimum wage. We have sick time. We have really big initiatives, bold initiatives that our city council can push. And we went from a majority white council to, I would argue, one of the most diverse councils in America. We elected the first Hmong in Minneapolis history. We elected the first Somali in America's history. We elected the first Latina in Minneapolis history with ranked choice voting. We elected the first ever trans woman in Minneapolis, and we elected the first ever trans man of color in American history. And that was based on being able to rank your vote. 2008, I was going to do a little graph here. I was going to show a picture of Minneapolis City Council in 2008 and a picture of Minneapolis City Council now. And then use that as like a campaign bullet point. People talk about, I wonder how ranked choice voting impacts communities of color, and just have that picture show you that not only are we more reflected in our representation, is that now our representation are actually getting shit done. They're actually caring about issues that matter to me and my roommate, and making sure that the people who are working, who are now unemployed, can actually get good unemployment because they're making $15 an hour, right? So the work that we did back then to actually get people elected to push for the $15 an hour, it's actually coming true in COVID-19 with my roommate unemployed, actually able to get unemployment insurance based on the hard work we did, and that was based on what we did with ranked choice voting. Mm-hmm. Hopefully that was a good synopsis of the Minneapolis campaign over the past 10 years. And I'm happy to answer any questions if there's more.
You covered so much ground. That's fantastic.
I threw a lot at you. I threw a lot. I know. And I'm a bad talker.
Here, so I want to come back to that. But there's so many things. I just want to also say, that point you raised about the picture before and the picture after, we also like to look at that because here in Washington, Pierce County actually experimented with ranked choice voting for a little while. And then because of a series of sort of pushbacks from party insiders, as well as a shift to top two primaries, it was subsequently repealed. If you look at a picture of Pierce County Council and compared to Minneapolis, I mean, it's just shocking even there to look at the glaring disparities in representation. I do want to come back to one point. You raised the point about sort of the rapid increases in representation on elected bodies. You mentioned Philippe Cunningham and Andrea Jenkins. Can you tell me a little bit more about those two candidates? How has the landscape shifted before and after the introduction of RCV, and what role did RCV play in their election?
It's two very different elections I can talk briefly about. And I also want to throw in another election from Ward 9 in Minneapolis, Alonzo Connolly, if people are taking notes and want to research this. But for the trans woman that was elected, Andrea Jenkins, she was the chief of staff for Elizabeth Glidden, who was the champion of ranked choice voting in Minnesota. When Elizabeth Glidden decided that she was going to retire as vice president of the council, Andrea Jenkins said she was going to run. This was a council that did all that big stuff we were talking about, from controlling rent to $15 an hour. And we cleared the way for her, meaning she had no opponents in the ranked choice voting election, and she won overwhelmingly. Now, Philippe had a bigger fight. He was going up against Barb Johnson, who was the president of the council. She was elected in that seat for 2 decades, 20 years. Her family represented that seat for 4 decades, 40 years. So before I was born, she has been in that seat. And she has been less and less effective. The district has changed dramatically to being more people of color. This is North Minneapolis. And there were 3 people running. There were 2 people of color. So there was a trans man running, Philippe, another woman of color who was like an organizer background, and Barb Johnson. At the end of the first round, Barb Johnson squeaked out a very narrow first round victory. But after the organizer, so Barb Johnson was in first, Philippe, the trans man, was in second, and the organizer, black female, was in third place. When she dropped, they're redistributed, and Philippe won that election with a clear majority of over 51%. He is now doing a great job representing North Minneapolis. I just saw on Facebook he was welcomed into North High School with open arms, and just to see, as a gay man who had never imagined a trans man being in office, and him being there in North Minneapolis representing the Black community is something that I could have never imagined in my life, and he is doing a great job. Another particular election I want to talk about is the Alonzo Connolly race. Alonzo Connolly is a Latina representative in Minneapolis who represented a Latino district, but it was about maybe 40% Latino, 20% East African, so like a Somali, and then like the rest like white, so like a 40% white. She ran against 3 opponents. A white guy who was really good and really cool about like giving out breweries, like building breweries in Minneapolis and all these breweries, the Somali candidate, and then Alonzo Connolly. And when I'm saying how it mitigates money, what Alonzo Connolly did was that, like, I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna hire Somalis. I'm gonna hire people to speak the language, to go door to door, to actually communicate with that district. I know that I have my base. I know I have a lot of the first choice votes, but I'm gonna need a lot of the people that might not vote for me. So I'm gonna hire some organizers that's deep in that community. And then those organizers are gonna have events in bars and breweries all around the district. So Alonzo Connolly would have events in breweries. And give it up. I wanna give it up to Gary Schiff for opening up the brewery. Thank you, Gary. Look at my organizers who are here. Thanks to organizers who are here as well at the breweries full of Latina folks. So it was a way that she built a coalition to win. And so my ploy as we continue to like strengthen ranked choice voting around the country is that people think like it's a way that you need your first place votes, but you also need to go past your base to get more votes. And ultimately you become a better candidate. And because you're a better candidate, once you get into office, you're a better representative for your district.
Thank you so much, Mike. Sorry, there was a particular attendee who was disrupting the chat. I just made sure he was removed. Zoom bombing is a very real problem these days. If Chris or Lisa are listening, please do take a look at the chat as well. We're sorry about that. I want to move over to Maria and then come back to you, Mike, in a little bit, because there's a lot of sort of interesting points that we mentioned here. Maria, so you have served as a director of FairVote New Mexico and more recently as the campaign manager for Common Cause New Mexico. Can you walk us through why and how the voters in Santa Fe came to choose ranked choice voting?
Sure. So for a little bit of context, you know, Santa Fe is a fairly small city. We have about 80,000 residents right now. It is a majority minority city. It's about 55% or so Latino. Mm-hmm. And New Mexico as a state is also a minority majority state. So that is sort of the context of this. Now, back in 2006 or so, Santa Fe, there was voters in Santa Fe that felt that they were left out of the political process. These were Green Party folks. Santa Fe is like, you know, we have nonpartisan local municipal elections, but pretty much everybody has always been a Democrat who has held a seat on the council or as a mayor. So the Green Party folks were feeling disenfranchised and, that sort of knew about ranked choice voting and wanted to bring this reform to the city to be able to compete, right, to have a chance at winning something. There were some fairly influential folks in that group of people, not politically influential necessarily, but like opinion-wise influential, and they got the city to agree to establish a charter review commission to look at a few different things to be changed in the charter around elections, and one of them was ranked choice voting. So the commission was established, and after several months of looking into this, the commission came up with their recommendations, and they said, ranked choice voting is perfect, right? Like there's no reason why we shouldn't do this. Mm-hmm. It will definitely be a better system than the first past the post system we have now. And there was an interesting line on that report that said, I mean, we had a first past the post system in Santa Fe before then, but the other option was, should we do ranked choice voting or should we move to a traditional runoff, like 2-election runoff? Mm-hmm. And the commission said, why do a 2-round runoff when, why wait 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 6 weeks to mark your second choice when you can just do it that day, right? Mm-hmm. So that was the commission. That they had a strong recommendation for ranked choice voting. So the city decided, the council at that point decided, okay, let's let's follow this. Let's write an amendment to the charter and put it to the voters, right, to decide. So there were a couple of city council members who were very opposed to ranked choice voting, and they threw a couple of wrenches in that language for the charter amendment, which said, Santa Fe, the voters had to vote whether they wanted this or not. And the language said, Santa Fe shall have ranked choice voting elections when the equipment is available at a reasonable price, right? So those couple of sentences aside, the voters went to the polls and they, hold on.
You're okay.
Sorry about that. The voters went to the polls and overwhelmingly approved ranked choice voting. 65% of the voters said, yes, we want ranked choice voting. So what happened then, of course, was that those two little requirements in the charter language, what is adequate equipment and what is a reasonable price, allowed the council to kick the can for 10 years and not implement ranked choice voting. Mm-hmm. So the voters approved ranked choice voting in 2008. I became director of FairVote New Mexico in 2017, and my task was to be a thorn on the side of the city council and have them implement this, because 10 years is long enough to kick the can. Mm-hmm. They still did not want to do it. Our Secretary of State, who is an amazing, voting access advocate, said, okay, I'm going to take care of this, right? I am going to upgrade the voting equipment for the whole entire state, and I'm going to ensure that each single voting machine in the whole entire state has the software that handles ranked choice voting. So the equipment is there and the price is free for the city, right? They still didn't want to do it. So because what Cynthia said, right? If you're in power, you don't want to change anything, right? You got elected, why would you change anything? Yeah. So at that point, I got four other Santa Fe voters to agree to file a lawsuit with me. We hired an incredible lawyer who is now actually running for Congress for my congressional district here. And we won. It went to the state Supreme Court, and they said, yeah, this is the law of your city. And the judge actually said the city clerk's anxiety is not accounted for in the charter language. So you just have to go and do it.
See, it's ironic. In San Francisco, we passed what is called instant runoff voting here. The main argument, I think, that swayed San Franciscans was the ability to avoid the cost of a second election, which was, millions of dollars.
And Maria, I want to get to the second part of what you were saying. So once this did pass, how did the prospect for representation and the ground reality for folks shift? And also, can you speak a little bit about, I know, Santa Fe does not quite use the multi-winner form of ranked choice voting, but could you also explain how that kind of works out for our listeners?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so we had the election, right? The Supreme Court ordered the city to implement about 9 weeks before the election. So it was wild. We had to, luckily I'm also an organizer, so I had all this work ready to rubber hit the road, right? As soon as we got going, we trained the candidates and the campaigns. We did a lot of voter education, and in the end, that election, for a variety of reasons, but ranked choice voting being one of them, we saw a 10% increase in voter turnout. It was a mayoral year election. And, the context that I gave at the beginning of this, when I was starting to talk about this question, in terms of like Santa Fe's racial composition and whatnot, the council, the governing body in Santa Fe, has been fairly well represented racially, right? We've had, it hasn't been like Mike was saying in Minneapolis was like old white guys. We've had several old white guys, and there's always some white guys there, but it's, it's been racially fairly well represented. We always have some Latino folks there. We always have some white folks there, and that's about the extent of the representation. We haven't had a Native candidate, which is like the other part of our diversity here in the city. What did change with the ranked choice voting election, we went from, we have a governing body of 9 people, so it's like 8 councilors and the mayor, right? before ranked choice voting, we had 5 people of color and 4 white people. After ranked choice voting, we had 5 people of color and 4 white people. So that didn't change. Mm-hmm. What did change is we got a lot more, we got younger folks elected. We got sort of like unlikely candidates who said, I'm gonna throw my hat in here, I'm gonna try, right? And they got elected. And we did see some of those coalitions, right, being built. The other thing that changed significantly, and now we've had 2 rounds because we had that mayoral election, and since then we've had a council election. We have a majority woman council now, so that's also changed. I do want to say that since Santa Fe passed ranked choice voting, the city of Las Cruces in the sort of the southern border by Juarez, in New Mexico also changed to ranked choice voting, and they had their first election this last year, and their council changed significantly. For one thing, they'd had a mayor who's been an incumbent for 3 terms already. That mayor ran again, and he actually won again. But for the past 2 or 3 times that he's run, he's had very little competition. One time he ran completely unopposed. This time there were 10 mayoral candidates, right? Everybody threw their hat in, and it was amazing. And their council is majority Latino at this point. It's a very young council. It's like full of organizers and like community leaders at that level. So it's just really changed the flavor of our governing bodies and like who's throwing their hat in and what kind of conversations are had, because it's younger, it's more female, it's more sort of a community leader based rather than old school, people whose daddy was a mayor also.
Thanks, Maria. I do want to take a little bit of time here to come to some of the audience questions, because I know a lot of folks have come with questions here. So the first actually is for Chris. Excuse me, from Chris, it's for Mike. In Minneapolis with no primary, have you heard people complain that too many people are on the ballot?
Yes. That's something that you have to work out. So the question is, what's the threshold to getting on the ballot? And setting expectations first about like how long it's going to take to count, quite frankly, and what's the threshold to get on the ballot. If there's no threshold, meaning no signatures a requirement, there's going to be Captain Jack Sparrow that's going to run for mayor. Okay, you can't stop that from happening. And what typically that would just be a full primary ballot. So I would say both things need to happen at the same time. If you're pushing ranked choice voting, to actually try to figure out what's the requirement to get on the ballot. And I would say a signature requirement or some type of threshold will be useful.
Great. The next one, Maria, let's come to you. Do immigrant communities' perception of ranked choice voting differ from US-born people of color? The question is for all, so anybody can weigh in. I've wondered about how immigration status might affect perceptions of electoral reform. So Maria, let's start with you, and then anyone else who wants to jump in.
I mean, that is a difficult question to tackle. For one thing, largely immigrant communities, if they're, not first generation, but like actual immigrant communities, a lot of those people are not allowed to vote, right? So like that's problematic. However, when we were in Santa Fe and in Las Cruces, both places have large immigrant communities. The voter education efforts that we engaged in involved those communities a lot, because this is an opportunity. Ranked choice voting really opens up the ability for all communities to seek representation, right? So like, even if you can't vote, you can campaign for somebody, you can help somebody get elected because you think that they're going to represent your community, which happens more with ranked choice voting than first past the post. And I'd like to say more with multi-winner than with a single winner ranked choice voting. So, but in terms of perception, it's not a difficult concept to understand if you stay away from tabulation and the math of it, right? Like, do you have a favorite? And if your favorite person can't win, do you have a second choice? Like that is this, it's easily understandable by US born and otherwise other place born people. Like there's not a cultural divide there that I've experienced, at least.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that talking point often does get lobbed at communities of color. You know, is this something that they're going to understand? And yet around the country, you're seeing folks use it. And there's absolutely no sort of, there's a lot of data at this point to show that folks are understanding it well, they're fully ranking their ballots, and it's being used well. Anyone else want to jump in on this question before we go on to other ones? Cynthia?
Yeah, so I would say it's less about immigration status. I mean, where we have seen the conflict that I've seen is more around communities of color and whether they can, you know, get a majority minority district, weighing that against a situation, for example, in a multi-winner situation, where they might be able to potentially get more representatives. So do they go for the sure thing, or do they go for the opportunity to have multiple representatives where, you know, there isn't, you know, a baked-in majority? So I think I've seen that kind of debate, and I don't think that has, that's just in general for communities of color rather than based on immigration status.
I want to stick with you for 1 second, Cynthia, because there is another question for you. Do you see the day when the commission could draw multi-member districts and we could solve gerrymandering and represent more voters by having proportional representation? And in this, the person cites the Fair Representation Act, HR 4000.
I mean, theoretically, yes. You know, Mohit and I have had this debate back and forth. You know, I think that in the US, we are so used to single winner districts that I think it's an education challenge to explain multi-member districts to folks. Of course, it's very common in other parts of the world, but you know, the California Commission would be happy to draw multi-member districts as much as it draws single member districts. It would actually solve a lot of the challenges that we have, right? Because when we are trying to, you know, figure out where to draw the line, we know that we're inevitably going to carve up somebody, right? And we're doing our best to try to protect as many communities of interest as possible. And we did a lot of internal debate, like we can't avoid splitting this community because the size of the district dictates this community is going to be split because it's too big, right? So it would solve, I think, a lot of the challenges that the Redistricting Commission faced in trying to draw single winner, single districts.
Thank you, Cynthia. There's another question here by Wendy Williams. She says, I've been a supporter of ranked choice voting for a couple years now. Great speakers tonight. I couldn't agree more. However, when I see what happened in the Wisconsin primary and given the concerns about safe voter access to the ballot in November, I feel inclined to put ranked choice voting on hold for the next 6 months and to work on nationwide voter access and vote by mail until November. What do the speakers think about ranked choice voting versus the urgent need of safe voter access during the pandemic? I'll open this up to anyone who wants to jump in.
I'll take a crack at that. So I've been working, just wrapped up a contract where I was doing voter education in 4 states where the Democratic Party used a ranked ballot for their Democratic primaries this year. So that was Alaska, Hawaii, Kansas, and Wyoming. So, you know, because of COVID, these states had to really shift quickly and they got rid of their in-person voting and went to a by-mail ranked ballot. And this was on the quick because of COVID. It was a response to a crisis, and it worked tremendously well. And to me, these 2 reforms are made for each other. It's like a marriage made in heaven, right? Because you get to vote from home. You have some time to turn in your ballot. If there is a pandemic that you weren't anticipating, you still get to vote. You get your ballot in the mailbox and you get to turn it in. And then you don't have to worry about wasting your vote with a ranked ballot. If you look at what happened on Super Tuesday, where all these candidates dropped out from the Democratic primary, like the day or 2 before people went to vote, all those folks who had voted by mail beforehand, right, who early voted, a lot of those people, it's estimated that about 2.5 million people basically wasted their vote, right? Mike, are you one of them? Yeah.
Oh!
Yeah.
So
Not only am I one of them, I know hundreds of, I'm from Minnesota.
Yeah.
Okay. So Amy Klobuchar herself was on this block having people go vote early.
yeah.
Pete Buttigieg was my candidate. So, I mean, yes, there are thousands of people who wasted vote. I'm sorry to cut you off.
Right. So if you had, like, if we think about this, and I think that we need to be really brave and really visionary about this at this point, because our democracy is going to hell, and we are, incrementalism is fine, but let's ask for what we actually want, right? I think what I want is vote by mail with a ranked ballot. That makes perfect sense to me in every way.
In San Francisco, like the big argument for instant runoff voting was to just save the cost of another election. And if you're gonna have to mail people ballots and send them back, you kind of want to do that once.
Absolutely.
I couldn't agree more. Yes, everything Maria said. Just to add on to that point, we definitely, like, as an organizer, I'm in different states around the country. Our democracy is fundamentally broken. And the only way for us to fix it, right, is through a fixed ballot with ranked choice voting. The reason why I feel like we have so much effort to put into actually pushing vote by mail in the middle of a pandemic, it seems like a no-brainer, is that there's people who are in office that are winning based on them not winning with a true majority. We are stuck in America. We will have no progress, and we will continue to be polarized, unable to fight for things that we want without ranked choice voting. So I employ people in Washington to have to walk and to do both initiatives at the same time. Because if we get vote by mail and don't get ranked choice voting, it doesn't completely fix, I feel like, all the troubles with democracy.
I want to jump in here and just say that I couldn't agree more with this. I mean, here in Washington State, we've had vote by mail since 2011, which is a great thing. It improves access to the ballot, improves accessibility for folks. But you get your ballot 18 days early. So guess how many voters voted for one of just 4 candidates? Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, Warren, and Bloomberg. Just those 4 candidates alone, over 350,000 votes, actually close to 400,000. 25% of voters in the state wasted their ballot. You compare that to a state like Alaska, as Maria was saying, and you see the benefits of vote by mail without these sort of wasted votes because you combine it with ranked choice voting. Let me get to one more audience question here, just to make this, make sure people get their questions in. Rick asks, first he says, thank you so much for all of your hard work. In Denver and Colorado, we talk a lot about the successes in Minneapolis and Santa Fe. And how long our CV has been used in San Francisco. Have you seen voter turnout change in communities of color since adopting ranked choice voting? Mike, do you want to take a stab at that first? I know you.
Good question. So I try to only say things that I can back up with evidence, right? And so what I have said, because we can look at previous elections, that ranked choice voting has increased turnout. I've been called out by people who necessarily don't like ranked choice voting, so I want to be more careful with saying that. The last municipal election that we had in Minneapolis, we can tell that tens of thousands of people are more voting. Is it based on it was cold that one day, or it rained, or the exciting election, or we have a trans man running now, so it's cool? It's hard to say that the changing of the ballot changed, increased turnout, but what we can say, the changing of the ballot is not confusing. Changing the ballot didn't lower turnout, and all the positive from changing the ballot. I'm less likely to land on it's going to increase turnout for sure. One thing that does do in Minneapolis, it canceled the two-step process. So for sure, it's more votes in the primary. I mean, primary, nobody participated. But the question is whether or not, general election to general election, I try to not go into that battle because the population and issues and things so much have changed in America in the past 15 years. I don't know if anybody else want to take a stab at that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to say for San Francisco. I would just say San Francisco is a pretty engaged population. We have high voter turnout pretty consistently. So I don't know that it's changed our turnout. I would say, just as a general comment, though, that, people come out when it's an exciting election. We had a really exciting mayoral election this last time with, incredibly diverse set of candidates. And, I would point out that the African American population in San Francisco is extremely low, and London Breed still won. So, I mean, that's another comment about San Francisco voters, perhaps.
And I mean, in Santa Fe, we've had 2 election cycles, and one of them was a council race for 2 council seats only. So that was, as expected, a much lower voter turnout. But the 2 mayoral elections we've had, one in Santa Fe and one in Las Cruces, they both were exciting elections. Like I said, in Las Cruces, they had 10 candidates, which is a little much. And it was because of what Mike was saying, like there's 0 requirements in terms of signatures or anything else in Las Cruces. So anybody could just walk and get on the ballot. But the thing that I saw in terms of campaigning, both in Santa Fe and Las Cruces mayoral elections, were, candidates have to reach out beyond their base, right? Candidates need to, the onus is on the candidate to educate the voters on why they should vote for them, why they should be their first or second or third choice. So people are talking to voters a lot more, and that includes voters of color. When you have a first past the post system, people often, there's like a candidate that is assumed to get like the whatever turnout is going to be from whatever communities of color, and nobody puts the effort into that. With ranked choice voting, people actually need to knock on those families' doors and have conversations with people. So that engages folks, that engages communities, and I cannot help but thinking that is going to increase civic engagement and voter participation.
Thank you so much. One final question before we wrap up here. Are there any good guides for field organizers for candidates running under ranked choice voting out there?
Yes. Mike, you want to take that?
What do you, Mike?
Okay, so Maria's it's the best person in the nation to build out campaigns. We have plenty of blueprints. I was just in New York City, who is the newest state who is running the largest education campaign this nation has ever seen, where I've trained in like several dozen of candidates. Fortunately, I'm not flying back there anytime soon, so there's a lot of Zoom meetings that we're having with educating candidates out there. So Maria and somebody, Grace Ramsey, who's also a dynamic organizer with ranked choice voting, has built one hell of a boot camp for candidate training, because it fundamentally changes how you campaign. Maria, you want to talk about it? Could be a 3-day training or a day training or like a Zoom meeting training. There's different dynamics. I've done it 3-4 times, and it's just gotten better every time. Maria.
Yeah, I mean, we've done my colleague Grace Ramsey and I have done several trainings for candidates, and not just candidates, but their campaign staff, their volunteers, et cetera, because it is a whole shift on how you do this. And it's amazing. Those trainings are actually my favorite part of this work, because I'll give you an example. When we were doing a candidate training in Las Cruces, we had over 50 people show up, people who were running for the same seats. And the fun thing for me as a trainer is like, okay, the whole training is based on a fictitious set of candidates, and like everybody on the training is working for one candidate, right? So like you take them away from their own campaigns and their own competitiveness with each other, and you put them all working together. And then there's these small group activities. So purposefully in Las Cruces, Grace and I paired up people, like some like Tea Party folks with like the most progressive candidates who are like running for the same seat. And it was like, okay, this is your working group. Like, work together to get your candidate elected. Let's work on messaging. And, at first they were like uncomfortable. And within 5 minutes, these folks were like rolling up their sleeves and like working so hard together. These people who would never even like have a conversation with each other. So that is the beauty of ranked choice voting right there.
Thank you so much. And we're coming up to the top of the hour here. So I do want to get one final word from each of you. Looking to the future, I'd like to hear about the outlook for elections in your state going forward. So, voters and advocates in all 3 of your states have enacted significant improvements to the electoral system, whether it be independent redistricting commissions or ranked choice voting. So what's next on the horizon, and what can we expect to further improve representation in elected bodies? What are you hoping for? Let's start with Mike.
Yeah, so in Minnesota, our fearless leader is Jean Massey. If you haven't met her, you should. Who is leading? We have two campaigns. One is called the Local Options. So in Minnesota, the state constitution says that you can't change elections unless you have your own charter, unless you have your own city constitution. It's a wonky state statute. So we have to change state law to allow any city that wants to use it for municipal elections in Minnesota that has to go through the state legislature and signed by the governor. And then there's the old-fashioned statewide that we want to be. Maine's already did it. We think in Massachusetts is next, if I'm not mistaken, Maria. And then Minnesota, we got the three M's coming, Maine, Massachusetts, and Minnesota, to actually have statewide elections. So when you're voting for any election, you're actually ranking your ballot. So local options, statewide reform, we hopefully will be the third state in the nation here. And thank y'all for having me. And I'm willing to come back and join you out whenever y'all need me, Washington, FairVote Washington.
Thanks, Mike. Cynthia?
So unfortunately, our governor is not a fan of ranked choice voting, even though the California legislature actually passed legislation, you know, in both chambers to institute statewide ranked choice voting. So it's unfortunate. So anyone who has ideas on how to convince Gavin Newsom to support it, vetoed it, unfortunately. But we've had, you know, I mean, California's instituted just about every other voting reform to make voting more accessible. And the last experiment was on vote centers, which probably are going to be a moot point during this pandemic. And so I think right now the state has its hands full trying to figure out how to get redistricting done in time. So the constitutional deadline for the California Citizens Redistricting Commission to deliver the new maps is August 15th. And if the Census Bureau gets permission to delay the results by 6 months, and it means California will get it at the end of July, and it will be really impossible to draw the districts with public input in a couple of weeks. So I think that's the next best thing, is that we're just trying to figure out how to deal with our constitutional deadline and the possible extension of the census.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. And finally, last but not least, Maria, over to you.
So New Mexico has, like I mentioned, a formidable Secretary of State who is our chief election officer. And we have a couple of really amazing legislators who really work hard on getting good governance and good election reforms. Last year, so not 2020, but in the 2019 legislative session, we passed all kinds of good bills regarding voting. So automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration. There's, we now have, slipped in there in a 500-page bill. We just now have a local option for any city that wants to do ranked choice voting. Before it was like Minnesota that it had to be a charter city. Now any city can do it. And it's not only they can do it, but it's incentivized by the state. Like you actually, if you do ranked choice voting, the state pays for your election. So there's like a number of things that we that we got passed last year that were really amazing. And I want to clarify, not just if you have ranked choice voting, but if there's like we changed the law so that all local elections would happen on the same day. Then if you sign up for that, it's optional for municipalities, but if you sign up for that, the state will pay for your election. And if you do ranked choice voting, the state will pay for your election. If you do a 2-round runoff, the state won't pay for that second one. So that's the incentive right there to do ranked choice voting. So 2020 was fairly quiet in terms of election reform in our state because we got so much done last year. Everybody was kind of taking a break. For 2021, there is talk about bringing a constitutional amendment bill to allow for legislators to use ranked choice voting for other, any and all other elections other than municipal, because municipal is all we can do ranked choice voting in the state of New Mexico now. So this would open it up to having it for primary elections, for general elections, whatever. So that is something that is likely to happen in 2021, and that would go to the voters. And if the voters approve, we might just have ranked choice voting statewide. We don't have a citizen ballot initiative process at the state level in New Mexico, so everything must be done through the legislature, which, you know, it is a challenge because, again, people don't want to change what they got elected through.
Right, right. Thank you so much, Maria. One thing we do have in Washington is that very process, the statewide ballot initiative. So that is something that we'll be looking to do in Washington, perhaps next year for the 2021 ballot. In the meantime, we have the local options bill here in Washington as well. That's a permissive bill that allows any jurisdiction to use ranked choice voting if they want to. It doesn't mandate it, but it gives the option. Several jurisdictions from Bellingham to several folks, community leaders in and around the area have expressed interest in ranked choice voting. So if this discussion sparked your interest, I encourage you to sign up, be a supporter on our website. You can email us at info@fairvotewa.org. Get in touch with us and let us know how this webinar went. And thank you so much to all of our panelists. This was such an informative discussion for me as well. I learned an awful lot from each of you. So thank you very much and hope to see you again. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good day.